The White Woman of Spring Creek, a ghost story. The story that follows is a mix of fact and fiction. All events in Part 1 are factual, as is the geography of the story from beginning to end. Part 2 is fictional, which is to say it might have happened that way. Parts 3 and 4 mix fact and fiction. Maybe the best way to explain this is to say that this story is true except for the parts that are not. A solemn thing it was, I said, a woman white to be, and where, if God should count me fit, her hallowed mystery. Emily Dickinson, Wedded, 1861, 1862. 1. Late in the fall of 1836, Zachariah Morel left the frontier settlement of Wheelock, 8 miles northeast of here, bound for the falls of the Brazos, near present-day Marlin. Zachariah had earned the nickname Wildcat as a rambunctious youth in South Carolina, but by 1836 had grown into a sensible man, 36 years of age, 15 years married, and father to 4 children. He had a farm in the river bottom near the falls of the Brazos, but Wildcat Morel spent much of his time ranging over the thinly populated Brazos Country as a backwoods Baptist preacher. On that November morning, the Morel family went out of Wheelock on the road we today call FM 46. Then nothing but a rough wagon track through a desolate timber of stunted hickories, scraggly oaks, and lonesome pines. From the seat of his wagon, Morel eyed the tangled thickets closely, and often turned his head to check the road behind. The desolate timber in the Brazos country was in those days a dangerous place, where something very bad might happen to a Texan who failed to keep a sharp lookout. Sam Houston had destroyed Santa Anna's Mexican army at San Jacinto in the spring of that year, but Mexico was still at war with Texas, and the Indians were riled to violence by secret agents from south of the new border. A team of oxen moved slowly over the best road, and the road from Wheelock to the falls of the Brazos was in those days very far from the best. So evening found the Morel family scarcely 15 miles northwest of Wheelock, somewhere in the vicinity of today's Franklin. In the autobiography he wrote many years later, Morel tells us, "We camped near a house a little off the main road." That house was the home of a family named Harvey, of whom I will tell you more in a moment. In anticipation of unwelcome midnight visitors, Wildcat Morel told his 2 sons, whose ages were then 11 and 13, to check that their flintlock muskets were loaded and ready to fire. He gave the same instructions to a young man named Reed, who had joined the Morel family as a traveling companion. He told all 3 to sleep with their bags of musket balls tied around their necks, and with their gun locks under their blankets to keep the powder dry. These precautions were not needless, as just before midnight the dogs set to barking, and Wildcat rose to see more than 100 Indians watching his sleeping family from the shadows on the far side of the fire. Crying out to wake the camp, Wildcat ordered young Reed and his 2 sons to stand beside him in a line partly concealed by shadow, muskets shouldered, triggers fingered, facing the Indians with the dying campfire between. The Indians could see firelight flickering on the 4 musket barrels, and they did not like that sight. But the glare of the fire and murk of the shadows precluded their seeing that 2 of those muskets were in the hands of small boys. They menacingly advanced, lost courage, and silently slipped into a ravine close by. After a sleepless night, the Morels continued northwest in the direction of what is today the town of Bremen. An hour before noon, they were overtaken by a squad of 15 Texan soldiers, who were also bound for the falls of the Brazos, and, quote, trusting in God and these soldiers, end quote, continued to a second night's camp on the Little Brazos River. With nothing to eat but wild turkey and honey, the Morels and soldiers rolled up in their blankets and prayed for a quiet night. So the night proved, but in the morning a horseman galloped up the Wheelock Road and, quote, the news was soon received that Harvey and his family, occupying the house near our last camp, were all killed by the Indians in the evening after we left. Two. The horseman's news was not entirely correct, for Harvey's oldest daughter had by strange good fortune survived the massacre of her family. Her name was Isabel, and she was 19 years old. Isabel was also somewhat touched in the head, and had been that way since receiving the news that her betrothed, a young man named Abner Henry, had been killed by a Mexican musket ball at San Jacinto in April last. Isabel still did her chores, albeit in a listless and far-away manner, but she now never left the house when the sun was in the sky. And in the night, when she believed her family was sleeping, Isabel dressed herself in the white muslin frock she had hoped to wear on her wedding day. And in that white dress, Isabel Harvey wandered like a ghost in the woods. Isabel's parents were alarmed and embarrassed by this queer habit, and so put it about in the neighborhood that Isabel had gone back east to live with an aunt in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Isabel was never seen out of doors in the daylight, and the Harveys had no near neighbors that might see her wandering in the night. This is why Isabel was absent the night the Indians swarmed the Harvey cabin. This is why the neighbors were not surprised that Isabel was not among the dead when they discovered the massacred family the following morning. If those neighbors had been more observant, they might have noticed the print of a small bare foot on the doorsill of the Harvey cabin, for Isabel had returned home and discovered those bloody bodies many hours before sunrise. The moon was full, and her white frock glowed as she crossed from the gloom of the forest to the porch of the cabin. She was, as usual, listless and far away, but she saw something was horribly wrong when she discerned the dark shape of her father's body lying face down in the doorway. She ran to the porch and, leaning on the doorpost, looked inside. Moonlight streamed through the window, and she saw her mother sitting upright in the bed, staring straight ahead, with the shaft of a broken arrow in her throat. Two motionless lumps, her little brother and sister, lay at her mother's side. Seized with horror and terror, Isabel turned to flee, insensibly stepping in the puddled blood of her father, and leaving that print of her small bare foot. Isabel Harvey was now more than ever mad, insane horror and terror, mixing in her mind with insane grief. But she was not so mad that she had lost the instinct of self-preservation, and so she ran, shrieking and ghostly white, down the empty Wheelock Road. That road was, as I have said, nothing but a rough wagon track, and more than one sane man had strayed from it in the clear light of day. Isabel Harvey was not sane, and the light of the moon, although bright, was very far from clear. As I also said, the Wheelock Road ran through a desolate timber of stunted hickories, scraggly oaks, and lonesome pines, and the crooked branches of the oaks cast a bewildering net of shadows on the face of the earth. Isabel Harvey was soon caught in that net, and so strayed from the road. As she did, a fresh wind began to blow out of the north, and the boughs of the lonesome pine trees began to moan. Tangled thickets of yaupon and greenbrier tore the muslin of Isabel's wedding dress. They scratched and scarred her arms and legs until the white of that dress was speckled with blood. Her hair was wild with leaves and twigs and the floating threads of spider webs. She was no longer shrieking, but she gasped like a swimmer who comes to the surface after having spent too long under water. It was perhaps a blessing that Isabel Harvey was too terrified to notice the noises of other creatures in the timber on that ghastly night. Sunrise found Isabel Harvey at the head of Pin Oak Creek, directly east of today's Hearn. The wind that had set the lonely pines to moaning in the night had become a norther, and Isabel knew she was not only lost, but that she was also very cold. You must not assume from her madness that Isabel was weak, or from her flight from the cabin that she was a coward. She was, as used to be said, a high-strung girl, but she was no less strong or courageous for that. Thus, although lost in the timber and cold as death, Isabel Harvey washed her face in the creek, combed her hair with her fingers, and did what she could to straighten the tattered remains of her white muslin wedding dress. Isabel Harvey was also enough of a woodsman to know that, although a creek may be very crooked, a woman who follows a creek will not be led in a circle back to the place where she began. Thus, folding her scratched and bloody arms over her breast, Isabel Harvey began walking down Pin Oak Creek. Many hours later, somewhat cheered and warmed by exertion, Isabel saw through the bramble the bulky brown shape of a foraging bear. It was to evade this bear that she left Pin Oak Creek near the spot where it is today crossed by FM 2549. And because she evaded the bear and left the creek, Isabel Harvey was very soon once again lost in the woods. Her path followed the line of the modern road along the ridge that divides Pin Oak and Spring Creeks, for here the trees were more widely spaced, and the timber frequently opened in prairie glades. But Isabel Harvey was now very cold and very hungry and very tired. As the sun went down, her instinct to survive began yielding to fatal despair. She had reached the top of a low hill that separates the north branch of Spring Creek from its main channel, the low hill incidentally just south of Spring Creek Oasis, when she sank exhausted against the rough trunk of a post oak tree. At the base of this tree, she thought, may very well be the spot where Isabel Harvey dies. At first she merely slept, but when she awoke she was deathly cold, and an icy moon hung before her in an inky sky. The crooked branches of the oaks once again cast their bewildering net of shadows on the face of the earth, but Isabel was now caught in the net and too tired to struggle against it. The thought passed through her mind that everyone she had ever known was dead or believed that she was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. No one would come to look for her. In the distance, the cold north wind made the boughs of a lonely pine moan. Once again Isabel slept, and this time she dreamed. It was summertime, the year before last. Her father had just finished their new cabin on Mud Creek, and there was still hope that the dispute with the Mexican government would not come to war. Her brother and sister were on the porch, engaged in a friendly quarrel over a kitten. Her mother, singing, hung wet laundry on the line. Isabel herself was 17, and her beau, Abner Henry, was calling her name from the gate. It was a lovely dream, but then Isabel awoke, and it was dark, and she was cold. Isabel had slumped in her sleep, and she pressed her hand on the ground to straighten her back against the tree. Under her right hand she felt something smooth and hard. Raising it to her eye, Isabel saw it was a milky white stone. She had very little education, and so did not know it was a pebble of what scientists call quartz. But she did know that the milky white pebble was in its own way as lovely as her dream. It was smooth and hard, and, like the remaining clean spots of her dress, a milky, nay, a ghostly white. She held the white pebble before her to compare its color to that of the icy moon. Then she clasped it in her hand and slept again. 3. Tens of millions of years before Isabel Harvey clasped her hand round that smooth white stone on the hill above Spring Creek, a boulder rolled down the side of another hill in New Mexico. It came to rest in a gully that emptied into a draw, that emptied into a creek, that emptied into a branch of the old Brazos River. And in that gully the boulder for centuries remained. In time, however, there came a flood that rolled the boulder down the gully to a lower resting place. After 100,000 years of such rolling and resting, the boulder had broken into fragments. Some of these fragments were fragile and disintegrated into sand. Some of these fragments were durable lumps of quartz. Through innumerable stages of rolling and resting, these durable lumps of clay were rounded and smoothed into pebbles that were milky, nay, ghostly white. and over millions of years these pebbles made a slow journey by stages towards the sea. As Isabel's smooth white stone neared the Gulf of Mexico 1,000,000 years ago, it came to rest in a gravel bar beside the old Brazos River. As had happened so many times before in this pebble's slow seaward journey, the old Brazos River then changed its course and the gravel bar was left high and dry. Meanwhile, far away in the north, great glaciers grew, sea levels fell, and the Brazos River cut itself a new valley 5 miles farther west. Tributaries of the Brazos followed the example of their parent stream, so Pin Oak Creek and Spring Creek cut new valleys too. This is how that old gravel bar and that ghostly white pebble came to be stranded on the top of that hill. This is why they were waiting when Isabel Harvey sat down on that hill to die. It was nearly 60 years after Isabel Harvey's last night on that gravel-topped hill that men began to quarry that gravel. The operation was called the Sutton Gravel Pit, and it was the property of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, the main line of which ran 1.5 miles to the east. The railroad wanted the gravel to ballast its track, as ballasted track would permit its trains to double their speed to 45 miles an hour. Thus, in 1892, the Texas Central Railroad built a short spur to Isabel Harvey's hill, hired a gang of 50 convicts from the state penitentiary, equipped these convicts with mules, scrapers, and shovels, and ordered the convicts to each day fill 50 railroad cars with small, smooth stones. J.W. Allen was the superintendent of the Sutton Gravel Pit. Here are 3 letters that Mr. Allen wrote. Sutton Gravel Pit, Robertson County, Texas, November 29th, 1894. To Frank B. Goodrich, Chief Civil Engineer, Houston and Texas Central Railroad, Houston, Texas. Dear Mr. Goodrich, I write to inform you that the next shipment of gravel will fall short of the quota because the convicts are shirking and refuse to work at the north end of the pit. I have threatened to send them back to the penitentiary, and you know that most convicts prefer outdoor work to a prison cell. But this miserable gang has begun to see things the other way round. The trouble began with an old Negro farmer named Moses Watson, who rents a little sandhill farm just north of the pit. Old Watson was slipping into camp and frightening the convicts with silly stories about a ghost he calls the White Woman of Spring Creek. This is a local legend among the country folk hereabout, all of whom claim they have seen her at one time or another. But this tomfoolery is a nuisance for business, and I have warned old Watson to keep off the property. I'm afraid the damage is done, however, and you must expect the next shipment to be short. Yours truly, J.W. Allen. Sutton Pit, Robertson County, Texas, January 5th, 1895. To Frank B. Goodrich, Chief Civil Engineer, Houston and Texas Central Railroad, Houston, Texas. Dear Mr. Goodrich, I am sorry to report that this confounded white woman business has gotten worse, and the output of gravel at the pit has fallen by half. All the men say they have seen her in the trees along the edge of the pit, sometimes in the morning, but most often in the evening after the sun has gone down. They say she wears a tattered white dress and seems to be asking them to look at a small stone she carries in her hand. This is all nonsense, of course. The convicts are ignorant and superstitious, but mostly they are rascals who will tell any lie to lay down their shovels and stop working. My plan is to shame them by spending tomorrow night in the pit alone. I will have to build a big fire because it's going to be very cold. Yours truly, J.W. Allen. McLeod Hotel, Dallas, Texas, January 6th, 1895. To Frank B. Goodrich, Chief Civil Engineer, Houston and Texas Central Railroad, Houston, Texas. Dear Mr. Goodrich, I write to inform you that I resign my position as Superintendent of the Sutton Gravel Pit of the Houston and Texas Railroad. I apologize for the short notice, but I will not spend another day in that place or in that position. As you can see from the return address of this letter, I departed the pit this morning and took the first train north to Dallas. I will tomorrow proceed to Chicago, Illinois, a city in which I will henceforth permanently reside. The guards at Sutton Pit have locked the convicts in their barrack, but a very high state of anxiety prevails throughout the camp, and I suggest that the company undertake an immediate evacuation. Yours truly, J.W. Allen. P.S. Do not look at her stone. 4. It is easy to get spooked in a Texas timber, especially when a cold wind blows out of the north, an icy moon is full, and the crooked branches of the oaks cast a bewildering net of shadows on the face of the earth. And I can tell you that no Texas timber is as spooky as the timber on Spring Creek, especially in the vicinity of the old Sutton Pit. I have wandered in that timber on cold and moonlit nights, and although I do not know that I saw the white woman of Spring Creek, I do know that I saw something tattered and white moving like a ghost through the trees. That is why I am today of a mind very much like the mind of J.W. Allen after he spent that night in the pit 130 years ago. That is why I think I may know what he learned when Isabel Harvey showed him her ghostly white stone. A timid thing to drop a life into the purple well, too plummetless that it comes back, eternity until. Emily Dickinson, Wedded, 1861, 1862.